an opportunity to ask Jackie and Sarah questions. The way we like to do this is that we ask you to submit your questions throughout the talk using the chat function. And I will then collate the submitted questions and put them to Jackie and Sarah on your behalf following their presentation. Okay. So I think this is where the recording actually starts. We are delighted to hold tonight's event as part of the Lucy Gives Giving Week. Over 7 days, ending this Sunday at noon, we are raising funds for 4 key initiatives to help Lucy boost social mobility and become the best place to tackle the global issues of the day. And we are super thrilled to let you know that to date, over 200 supporters have helped us raise more than £135,000.
Fantastic. Great.
We are now hoping to reach 250 donors, because that will unlock another £1,000 for the cause. Thank you very, very much to everyone for your incredible generosity so far, on behalf of all of us at Lucy. If you haven't yet donated, but you're listening and you'd like to give, then please look out for the link that will be circulated during and after this event. All gifts, large or small, will make a real difference and can help us unlock further matched funding pledged by alumni and friends, doubling the impact of your gift. Also, don't forget to take part in our Together for Lucy event on Saturday to help celebrate the strength of our global community. Take a look at the Lucy website for more information on that. Okay, after all this information, it's time now to introduce our speakers. And it's my privilege to introduce to you Jackie Ashley, who is a journalist, broadcaster and campaigner, as well as, of course, very importantly, being the 8th Lucy Cavendish College president.
Yay.
During lockdown, Jackie was appointed chair of the National Brain Appeal, which raises funds to advance treatment and research at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and the UCL Queen Square Institute of Neurology. Sarah Sands is the board director of Hawthorn Advisors and is the first woman to edit the Sunday Telegraph. She's chairwoman of the political think tank Bright Blue, a patron of National Citizen Service, and sits on the board of London First. I think that's enough information. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jackie and Sarah. Please welcome them warmly.
Thank you so much for that. And congratulations. We were just talking about you becoming a professor, so that's brilliant news for you. And Jackie, do you want to start with sort of explaining the title and how we thought it might
Okay, I would do that. All right. And let me add my congratulations to Henriette. Very proud of you, Henriette. That's wonderful. So Sarah and I were having a chat about what we thought might be of interest to all of you, past students, present students, alumni, even people, dare I say it, as old as ourselves. And we were thinking about the very strange times we're living in now. And also we both have children in their 20s, so we're thinking very sadly about their very strange work times. And then we thought, actually, as women, we have throughout our lives had times of uncertainty, not caused by COVID, but caused by other things, from elderly parents to children to getting fired from a job, not wanting to stay in a job, all sorts of things. In my case, my husband had a severe stroke and I was out for nearly a year looking after him. And we thought, actually, what's happening in COVID is something that has happened quite a lot to many women throughout their lives. They have to keep chopping and changing. You can't necessarily sort of assume that a job is there for life anymore, as I did assume when I first entered the employment market after leaving university myself. So we thought what we'd do is chat a bit about our own personal experiences, a bit about our daughters. We both have daughters who are in theatre, so that's not exactly great. And a bit about, you know, how students coming out of university in particular can navigate this really strange time, but with joy and without too much trepidation, and see that actually being able to chop and change quite a lot throughout your career is actually a great thing. Sarah and I have both done that. We're both journalists at heart, but we're both doing very different things now. So we thought it might be interesting if we just sort of charted our rather strange careers and gave some tips on how you survive during coronavirus and afterwards, when I think the work environment will be very different. So Sarah, do you want to add some more to that before we sort of get going?
Yeah, I think it's not being able to plan things is obviously something new, and we see that certainly, you know, with our children, who, when you're starting a career and then it just stops, and you don't know quite when it's going to start or in what form. And already I'm delighted by seeing some of the sort of just flexibility and resilience actually amongst some of my daughter's friends. There's one who was a very talented theatre set designer and is now doing little sort of Taj Mahal sheds in the garden for people, you know. And so but there's also that sort of tragic sense to that. There was a big row, wasn't there, last week over a picture of a ballet dancer, and it said she can reskill in cyber, and you thought, she's a ballet dancer, you know. So but I think that the curious point that Jackie raises is that, is there actually a sort of competitive advantage in some way, particularly for women, because they're maybe used to having to do things in different phases. And I certainly found I was asked, I did a podcast on women, and it was a Katie Ball's podcast for Spectator, and it always starts by, oh, did you always want to be, and what did you think? And I was rather stopped in my tracks, because Jackie had started in a tremendously distinguished way, that she went to a very, very good university and straight into, you know, sort of marvelous job in broadcasting, whereas I was a sort of punk rocker and practically a child bride. So, you know, so in my first job, you know, when I was sort of 24, I was also having to negotiate. I was also a single mother and having to negotiate that. And then, you know, we talked about sort of interruptions in our careers. You know, in my case, I've come up with a very sort of Pollyanna-ish expression that it's always for the best, you know, when you've got fired or when just things just don't work out as you expect to. And sometimes, you know, it is true that there are opportunities that you wouldn't have thought of, and that you and also it brings out qualities in you that you didn't think you had. But so do you want to start, Jackie, with maybe how you, so imagine you as a about the same time as some of the people listening, of thinking of embarking on a career, and what you thought and how you thought things would pan out.
Yeah, well, I was, as you say, slightly gilded in that I went to Oxford, not the best university, but the second best, and then straight into the BBC as a news trainee, which, you know, I think nowadays, if you're at Oxford or Cambridge, you've no hope in hell of going into the BBC. You'd far better to have gone to a Polly in the north, an ex-Polly in the north. But anyway, I went to the BBC as a news trainee, where I had a very sort of serious 2.5 years of journalistic training, going around all the local newsrooms, learning my shorthand, learning my law, doing all the business, and then started my career in the BBC that in those days I assumed would be for life. And I just assumed that forever I would work for the BBC, I'd work my way up, I'd become maybe something like editor of the Today programme, and that would be it. But of course, things changed, and I had various changes. I left the BBC and went to program called TVAM, which is now GMTV, which was the most horrendous 6 months of my life, because I couldn't deal with waking up at waking up in the morning and going to bed going to bed in the morning and waking up at sort of 6 o'clock in the evening to start a day's work. And there were some of us that just really couldn't manage it, and I was one of them. So I did that. But I left them and went then to Channel 4 News, which was just starting, and stayed there for many years. And that was all part of ITN. And I then transferred to ITN, where I worked for many years. The big change for me then was when I had some children. I thought it was part and parcel of life that I'd have the children and get back to work absolutely full time, as some women had managed to do and made it look very easy. And when I had one child, they were fairly pissed off, and what was I doing taking 6 months off? And then I had another child, and they really weren't very happy at all. And then to everyone's horror, I got pregnant with a third child. I have to say, all these were planned. It was not by accident. And they got very cross, and I asked for part-time work then, because I was finding it quite hard to do sort of 13-hour days with children that didn't sleep at night. And it was always made very clear to me that if I wanted to progress, then I just had to put the children totally on the back burner and work absolutely full time. Now, I don't think you'd find that attitude so much these days, but that was certainly the attitude. I was told literally I could become the next political editor of ITN if I was prepared to work 6 days a week, 13 hours a day. And I said, well, I can't do that. I've got 3 young children. So that was it. So it was made clear that my career prospects were really going nowhere as long as I stayed there. So I then moved, well, I then had about 6 months where I left ITN. I didn't do very much. I did bits of broadcasting here and there, and started to write, which of course is much easier to do from home. And I was then lucky enough to be hired by the new Statesman as their political editor. And from there to The Guardian, where I did a weekly column and political interviews. So in a way, becoming a newspaper journalist was something I never intended whatsoever, but that sort of came about because of having the children, which is something I hadn't anticipated at all. Spool on about 20 years a journalist there. And then my husband had a stroke, a very bad stroke. So I had to take the best part of a year, literally, to care for him, because at first he was in hospital for 3 months, needed daily visiting. Then he came home and couldn't walk at all, couldn't dress himself, couldn't feed himself. So that was pretty intense. He gradually got better with lots of physio and eventually got back to work. And he is now a TV journalist, has his own programme called The Andrew Marr Show, which he has been able to return to, which was fantastic. But by then I'd kind of lost my mojo with my job, and again was looking around appointments board, and after many hours, many grueling hours, about 5 different meetings and a whole day meeting everybody, and a dinner, of course, there had to be a dinner, and millions of interviews and millions of speeches, I became the president there, which again was something totally outside my expectation. If you'd said to me when I was a student, do you think one day you'll be head of a house at an Oxbridge college, I would have just laughed, because I wasn't the most academic person. I got a very good 2-1, but I certainly was never on course for a first. I was too busy doing journalism. So I think I'd have been amazed, my younger self, had I heard what I was going to do then. 3 years after that, I left Cambridge and came back to London, and I'm now doing various boards. I'm on the board of the Carers Trust, which is very busy, particularly at the moment. And I'm now chair of the National Brain Appeal, which is another sort of fascinating change. So I'm learning all about sort of rare dementia and epilepsy and stroke treatments and all sorts of strange things, and fundraising away as I did at Lucy. So in a way, I've had so many different changes, many of them brought about by a change in my circumstances. But in each new job, I thought, what a fantastic thing to be doing, what great new skills to be learning, what new people to be meeting. And I feel very lucky that I've had those different stages of my life, actually. But having said that, they were rather forced upon me. And I'm not sure that if they weren't forced upon me, would I still be in journalism at the BBC? Probably. So in a way, the life changes from being a woman, I think, through being a mother and then a carer for my husband. Those changes have been forced upon me, but I'm glad they were. So that's a very brief potted history of my life. But Sarah, I think yours has been even more sort of different, hasn't it? You've been all over the place. So why don't you give us your story now, and then we'll have a chat about it.
No, it's interesting you talking about, going really from the sort of familiar to the unfamiliar, which so yeah, so in a potted history of mine, so being this very much not a young role model, but a young mother, and just trying to sort of manage that. And as Jackie said, in those days, you weren't cut a lot of slack by your employers. So I think I had about 4 weeks maternity leave, I think, certainly for the sort of first 2, and was properly asked when I applied for a job, which I actually really needed. I was, on my own, that was the income, and they said, can you guarantee that this baby isn't going to get in the way? And I said, absolutely, no, you'll never hear his name mentioned. And I always remember a sort of encounter with, there was a, so this was at the Evening Standard that I applied for as a, in a job having done local news, been on a local newspaper. And I remember that the deputy editor, who was female, unusual actually at the time, and her once sort of looking at me slightly oddly and then saying, what's it like to have a child? And I said, oh, it makes no difference. I never see this child, thinking I'd learned. She went, oh, because I'm pregnant and it means a lot to me, because she was older. She was, I think, in early 40s, and had waited a long time. And this was a sort of big deal. So strangely, she was looking to me, for some sort of reassurance that it was a biggest friend. I was looking to her as this very senior figure. And so she did have a child, and she died actually shortly afterwards, when the child was still small. So I always sort of think of that and how pleased I was, that she had this son that meant a lot to her. I think it was called Max, and that was sort of completed her life. So I think always, sort of, take opportunities. And so anyway, that was the start. And then I sort of worked my way up a bit at the Evening Standard. And actually one thing I did find is, how to turn disadvantages into advantages, was that because, I was very cross at being dumped and being a single mother for one. And it was, and I knew that I had to keep this job. So it made me quite, quite ambitious. And I worked very hard. I had to be good at this. And I had to be good to prove that I was, worthwhile, and I needed the money. So, so I did quite well. And then, so I worked my up quite quickly, and then I was asked to go over to the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, which was a very sort of conservative, very conservative in both ways, newspaper under an editor called Charles Moore. And, from the moment I entered these sort of hallowed, this hallowed place, I think I was asked maybe sort of 5 times in the first week, Balliol, and I went, no, not. And, so there was, it was meant to be very sort of blue chip, but actually I found that, because I didn't have exactly the same background as others, and because I was sort of scrappier, and it meant that I could bring sort of qualities. And I think one thing was not to feel, sort of insecure about it, or because actually people on the whole, pretty friendly. So not to kind of take offense, not to feel inferior, not to feel insecure, but to make the most of what you can bring. So I would sort of tease them, and I could bring a kind of experience and knowledge that they didn't have. And actually I became very close to Charles Moore. So that went well. And then, in fact, that went very well. So then I was made editor of the Sunday Telegraph, which went less well. And by that time, okay, mistakes and lessons. I think what by that time I thought, okay, so they want a paper that's basically something else. It's a traditional conservative paper. They want it to be that's mostly read, by men in their 70s. They would like women in their 30s. Oh, well, I can do that, And so I have learned about sort of evolution since, but at the time I thought, okay, we can do it in 10 seconds. So I think partly, I was much too abrupt about what I was trying to do. And secondly, I wouldn't listen to anyone, because I just thought, so even people who were on my side, I remember Charles Moore, phoning from time to time going, everything right? And I went, absolutely fine, and clearly wasn't fine. And so I'd sort of lost the trust of the people who were basically, hiring me. I think I've always got on pretty well with my own sort of team, but there is an art to managing up, which I'm not still quite learned. But it is important in this case, because I got fired after 8 months. And so then I thought, so not only did I get fired, but there was a sort of peculiar situation that sometimes happens, is that the people you meet socially or romantically, are people that you meet in work, because that's, so anyway, I married a journalist who was at the Telegraph in a role as editorial director. So when I was made editor of the Sunday Telegraph, there was this conflict of interest, and he magnificently said he would stand down, that he wanted me to take this role. So he did that. I was then fired after 8 months. Neither of us had jobs. So that was a sort of low point for actually about a week. And then I got two calls. One was from David Cameron, saying that he was looking for someone to help with his media operation, and would I go to him? And the other was from the then editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre. And judge me if you will, one sent flowers and a chauffeur. that was Paul Dacre, and a contract, and kind of whatever you want involved. And the particular bit of the particular pleasure that gave me too was that I could I had this actually rather sort of severe contract with the Sunday Telegraph when they fired me, which I think probably one shouldn't have accepted, but said that you can't work anywhere else as an editor, and you only get a payoff if you can't work anywhere else. So it's that thing, that you don't want someone, but no one else can. You can't. Yeah. So in a way, interrupts your career. So anyway, I changed the title to consultant editor at the Daily Mail, and I stayed there, and then for I think sort of 2 or 3 years. Then out of the blue, I went to work for, it's a complete aberration, a magazine called Reader's Digest, because I love the idea of it. And in a way, a little bit of the same reason I love Lucy Cavendish is that it was about sort of education for everyone. It had the biggest circulation in the world in its time. And it had this thing, and it was small. The reason it was quite a small magazine was so that you could, labourers could fit it into their overalls, and they could read a word a day. How moving is that? So, and it was basically about sort of, and it was stories about, sharks, more or less. So I went there, and then I was, but then a friend of mine, or a former colleague called Geordie Gregg, went to edit the Evening Standard and asked if I would come back. So I'd only been at the Reader's Digest for sort of, I'd only done about 3 shark covers, and thought, well, do I move again? And then I think it's just sometimes, go with your instincts of, that in the end, I was a kind of newspaper girl, and, I knew what I was doing on the Evening Standard. So it was a bit sort of going home. I arrived there thinking, I'm back, it's Evening Standard, I know it, it's sort of great. And I was told that basically the paper had about 6 months before it would close, because it was, basically run out of money, circulation plummeting and so on. It was sort of total crisis. So that was a period of sort of firefighting, of having to try and find an economic model for it, to find an editorial model that went with it. But it sort of worked. You know, luckily it was successful, and we sort of cracked it, and then I went on to edit it. And so that was a time of sort of, at last, a kind of peak of stability and familiarity, and I knew what I was doing, and I understood newspapers. I had a really fancy office and a huge salary, so I gave that up to go and edit the Today programme for half the money and no office, and horrible hours, yeah. You know, there's a sort of all responsibility and no power. But I kind of thought I should try, you know, and I still think that thing of kind of give it a go. And it was just that, you know, when you do feel that you know something, I mean, it's very interesting you talking about leaving the BBC, and I hadn't realized quite what an unusual thing that is to do, both to come to the BBC as an outsider, but also to leave. So after 3 years, and I'd only recently been told that there was no need for me to have done all the hours that I did. It wasn't usual. No one told me not to. So I was doing from sort of 6 in the morning to these late night calls at sort of 11 at night and so on. And but leaving is quite unusual, and I thought, you know, I love this program. One or two things I sort of won't personally suit me about some of the sort of restructuring that they were doing elsewhere. But I love it. But I think I'm going to try something else now. And I think that, you know, people just couldn't quite understand that you don't leave the BBC. And I, oh no, but I can, you know, I think I will actually. So here I am again doing something that, and of course I left it at a time of, you know, maximum economic uncertainty, when actually just is the time to sort of hunker down and stay, you know, where you know you're safe. The BBC is a pretty safe place. But I thought, you know, what I really care about now is those businesses, you know, that the economy and what's going to happen to, you know, the children, their generation that we were talking about. Someone's got to go out there and try and, you know, start build. So so I was hired by this corporate strategy company, not something I've done before, with a particular brief to sort of back British businesses and find them and nurture them. And I'm now working on a sort of science and tech summit in the summer, which with a friend from the Science Museum. So already it's something sort of new and fun and sort of exciting, and it's basically a bit of a Today programme running order, you know. And so I actually feel re-energized, and that's an odd thing, because it's making moves that don't always make sense, but you sort of draw on something. I mean, I'm sort of interested you talking about, you know, the work you're doing now, and presumably that was partly your experience, you know, a terrible experience of what happened with Andrew, but it gave you a sense of real interest in the subject, and you'll bring all that to it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what one needs to do is just think all aspects of your life. I mean, my husband having a stroke was pretty horrid, but actually that did give me a new side to myself that I have then used in my career. And I think we tend to think, oh, it's our, you know, it's our degree and our work experience and our training. That's all I can do, you know. So because I've always been a journalist and I can't do anything else. When actually I think what one needs is a kind of mindset that says, yeah, I could do something else, actually. I don't know what you think, Sarah. I have done quite a lot of hiring in the last few years, both at Lucy and at the National Brain and Peanut Carers Trust. I've sat on the other side of those tables, you know, asking people about their CV and all that. And I think quite often that the CVs, especially when you're shortlisting, have they absolutely got the relevant experience? You know, that we only want someone that's done 3 years of, you know, marketing if we're looking for a marketing person. And then quite often when you actually interview people, you find that they haven't really got the right skills particularly, but they're just bloody brilliant. And they come over with a sense of, I could do this and I could do that, and I've got some ideas. And I do think there's a tendency these days to tick boxes when you're recruiting, that people have got to do this and that and the other. A lot of jobs say you've got to have a 2-1, you've got to have a postgraduate degree, you've got to have this, you've got to have that. And very often those are not the best people for the job. The best people for the job are the ones that come along to the interview and they've got a sparkle and they've got some ideas. And very often those are the ones you hire, of course. But I'm wondering if there's something in the system a bit lower down that's a kind of slight blockage that sometimes stops really good people getting through. And what you know, as a young person coming to the employment market, you can do to get round that. I suppose my advice would be to kind of always be a little bit unusual in your application. And if you haven't got the exact skill set, don't apologize for that. Just say, yes, I've done this, but I've got that, you know. I don't know what you think, Sarah. I know you've recruited a lot as well, but
yeah, I think that positivity is and confidence is such a thing. And you know, one thing I always noticed on the Today program, I'm sure you've come across the same, is that, you know, I would say to a male guest, you know, could you come on and talk about you know, gene therapy or something, and they maybe that their, you know, whole background was in business, but they'd go yeah, absolutely.
oh yes, of course, yes.
And you know, then you ask a woman who has spent her life in gene therapy, you know, to come and talk about it, she go, oh, I don't really know enough about that.
Exactly. Such a healthy multiplier.
Of feeling that somehow, you know, you're sort of underqualified. And I think that what I've realized is that people, you know, want to be reassured. I can see that now in business too, that, you know, people want to know that you've got some answers and some ideas. I took with me to Hawthorn a great political correspondent for the Today program called Ross Hawkins, who but he's been a political correspondent for, you know, 18 years or something. And so I didn't know how he'd adapt, and, you know, that maybe, you know, the idea that when you're dealing with business and but I said, you know, simple thing, remember when we were very destructive and now we're very constructive, you know? But just that sort of flipping. So, but the skills of just being able to, you know, work out a story, you know, work out with him actually just sort of aren't, you know, one thing I've always liked about journalists and people in politics is that they do respond very fast. And one thing is actually almost to slow it down, to think, you know, you don't have to come back in 5 seconds with a yes or something.
Yeah.
So I think some things that, you know, I'm trying to learn now is, you know, to understand actually a bit of sort of depth is one thing, which again, you're learning a lot about, you know, a subject, which seems a wonderful thing. You know, one thing I've gone to do is I'm writing something about Cistercian monasteries. It's not my subject, but it's the idea of knowing just knowing an awful lot about one thing is such a joy. So I think always that you can do more than you think, and then also, you know, that sometimes hobbies can seem like a job, or, you know, what you're doing. I think that whole way which you've seen under Zoom, and certainly trying to be in a business during Zoom, is that the whole, you know, personal professional thing has just sort of broken down. The hours have broken down. And to try and make the sort of most of that. That finding that actually it is sort of talking to people and being amongst, you know, friends and having a social life kind of matters, not just because it keeps you sane, you know, but also it sort of informs, you know, the way you are, so that you're not, you don't come out with sort of weird, you know, desiccated views on things. They're informed by human experience. And I think that makes you better. Everything certainly makes you better at business, at being able to, you know, calculate. And one example that I gave someone when everyone was, you know, everyone wants data now, everything just is about data. And you know, what I'm doing in corporate strategy, some of it is just trying to make sort of human connections and relationships. And so I was having a discussion about, can everything be done on data? And I said, I remembered being at GCHQ, where they, you know, have a ton of obviously mathematicians and brilliant sort of computer scientists. And and it was a story someone told me about how they were trying to track an ISIS fighter in Raqqa, and they just kind of couldn't get to him. They were trying everything, and he was just too under the radar. And as it happened, it was a woman and not a mathematician who said, you know, he's 23 years old, probably likes football. And so sure enough, they got him because he checked in on football results.
Wow.
You know? And it's that sense of those. Now that's not that wasn't something that she learned from yet another course on, you know, data. Yeah. It was just, so I do think that's, you know, that just being a rounded kind of person does, you know, helps both how you manage things, you know, with you you know, you had sort of those, well, the big sort of trauma of, you know, dealing with and a stroke. But before that, you were nursing your father, weren't you? You know, that you go from one role to another.
Yeah.
Did you, and how did you find that?
Yeah, well, yeah, I did have my dad. I think my dad died in the April, and Andrew had his stroke the following January. So I had sort of 6 months without being a carer. But again, you know, you then, I'm now doing stuff with carers and trying to influence government policy on carers, which is you know, something I feel very strongly about. So in a way, I wouldn't say I deliberately used that, but it just sort of almost came about. I think one thing that struck me, sort of listening to both of us as we talk about the way we've changed, in a way we were both very lucky, because people quite often would come to us and say, you know, how about this, how about that? And yes, we mustn't underestimate how lucky we are, because that doesn't happen to a lot of people. They don't have someone that phones up and says, oh, you've lost your job, you know, how about this? But I think part of the thing we both do, because we're both quite naturally chatty social, if I might say, is we make contacts of almost wherever we are. So, you know, I'd made them in the hospital, I made them with carers, made them with my dad's friends, I made them, you know, and I think you do that as well. Wherever you are, you make lots of contacts that you keep in touch with quite a lot. And so then when there are other jobs, other ideas, people might think, oh yes, what about her? You know, she's always jolly and sort of friendly, and we keep in touch. And I think just making contacts really wherever you can, I think along the way when you're working, is really important, isn't it?
Yes. No, I think the, you know, serendipitous sort of meetings, you know, could be at a bus stop or something, but just something, because, you know, otherwise, and certainly you've seen it with, you know, my children, I'm sure you have, is, but just, you know, that it's pretty, can be pretty, alluring when you've just had your 100th rejection, you know, just going through a sort of but you know, again, in a way, seeing then how you know, one thing actually, you know, my daughter was an example of so she had her, you know, 100 rejections as you know, through sort of conventional forms of being a sort of theatre director, and then someone gave her some really good advice that they just said, make your own scene. And it was a really interesting thing to have said. So what she thought is, well, what am I interested in? What can I do? And she was very interested in drag, was something she was particularly keen on. So she then, you know, found other people who were in South London, where she is, set up it was a sort of late night cabaret, and they just kind of helped each other out. So there's a circuit you can get on, you know, and she was doing a bit of stand up, and she was doing a bit of, so, and so she kind of made her own scene. Of course, you know, COVID's destroyed all that. But it was, you know, you could actually earn a living. And then she, so then that didn't work. And then she thought, well, you know, she wanted to do something with social purpose. And so she found that actually, one thing out of COVID, as we know, is, you know, a lot of children not having access to, you know, education. And in her case, they were children who'd been excluded in some way. She's loving what she does, you know, and she kind of does that plus a bit of writing. And again, it's not what she imagines she'd be doing. I think another thing for young people is just geographically, you know, it's one odd thing about COVID is sort of almost, so where do you go? I have a son in Hong Kong who's kind of thinking, well, maybe I should live in New Zealand, or so it's not even just the job, it's where you live to try and find work. And I think all those things which are, you know, very different from, you know, from the set of circumstances that we had. And I, you know, absolutely don't underestimate how tough it is. You know, I had a text from my daughter who's, because, you know, she's in that slightly sort of key worker role, is now on her third set of self-isolating, because you tend to come across people who, you know, had it, and just sent a message saying, you know, COVID just spoiled every nice thing. And I thought that's kind of a bad, you know, not a bad description of it, but just having to learn, okay, that's not working, what else can I do? You know, rather than just thinking you've hit a brick wall. Do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the geographical thing is quite important now, because I think, I mean, I do know that sort of people trying to get internships in London were hugely disadvantaged if they were not like my children, they happen to sit in London, you know, so mine could live at home and work for nothing, where they were very lucky, and it wasn't a fair system. But I think now, you know, you don't have to live in London, you don't have to have parents in London, because so many people are working from home. I think it's actually much easier. And I think it might have done away with that sort of London centric, you've got to be here or not. My son works in tech. And he's saying he's actually working for an American company now, but he's managing people. Some are in New York, some are in San Francisco, 2 are in Iceland, 4 are in Norway, you know, all over the place. And I said, God, doesn't that get tricky? And he said, no. I mean, you know, some people have to work a little bit in the evening, which isn't great. But he said the great thing about this, and this was happening in the tech world before COVID, but it's been sort of magnified now, is you can work anywhere in the world. And he says, because he hires a lot of programmers, and he says, you know, in the old days, if you were in San Francisco, you got San Francisco and sort of an hour or two outside San Francisco. Now you've literally got the whole world to trawl for your top programmers. And so I think in a way that geographical change has been fantastic, because people can now apply for jobs millions of miles away from where they live and still do it. So, you know, there are some advantages as well. Let's look at the time. I think perhaps we should stop for questions, Henriette.
Yeah.
Nattering on, but there may be specific things that people want to ask us other than us going on about our own careers.
No, that's been really absolutely interesting. So that's really wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that the audience will say thank you to you as well for that. There are some questions that came in. First of all, in terms of, you know, what you bring to an interview, 2 people have very rightly reacted and said that the problem these days is that to get an interview, if you are slightly different in background, if the computer is reading your CV, then you may never get through to interview, because it's all automatized, and so they're just looking for the keywords, and so you're thrown out before any human pair of eyes ever see you. I don't know if either of you want to react to that.
Yeah, I feel quite strongly about this tick box culture when it comes to recruiting. I actually sat for a while on the boards for the public appointments, so you know how they recruit people, and it was so tick box. You know, it's everyone, if the specification said you have to have 3 years experience of X, if you didn't have 3 years experience of X, then they wouldn't even bring you to interview. And you could see that a lot of good people, from their covering letters, you could see there were some excellent people just weren't being asked to interview. I mean, I always make a point, certainly if I'm on a board recruiting, I say, well, what about, I really like this person. Yes, they don't quite meet the qualifications, but let's bring them in for interview and see. But I fear, and Leslie's actually made a point, that quite often there's a text screening of keywords. And I think, you know, in big companies where there's a lot of applicants, people are increasingly using text screening. And so, you know, only certain candidates will get through. I mean, quite often, just if you've done a job for X number of years, doesn't necessarily mean you're that good at it. You know, quite often you come in new to a job and you bring new ideas and all sorts of different experience. You could be much better than the Joe that's been sitting doing that job for 10 years, but just thinks they're in line for the promotion. So it's something that I sort of rage against, is this sort of box ticking in recruiting. But I don't know quite how it's going to go away. I don't know what you think, Sarah, about that.
Yeah, it's really and you know, particularly if it becomes algorithmic, you're right. Then it's, and the thing is, people don't have, actually, when they advertised for my job for the successor, and I looked at the description and it said, you know, very experienced in broadcasting, has to have done, and I went, oh, so I wouldn't have got the job.
You wouldn't have got it, yeah.
So, you know, the fact that they were prepared to, you know, bend the rules for me, so why can't you do that, you know, for people who are applying earlier down? And you know, there are places, I think the Spectator's one, where they kind of have a policy, don't they? Don't look at a CV.
They don't look at your CV. They ask you to just write something, which I think is brilliant. And I think there was someone hired quite recently there who was a kind of older woman who had nothing to do with journalism at all, and just
that's right.
So I think that's brilliant.
And people have to be much more creative about recruiting. I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. Henriette, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we do. You have a question, both of you have a question from Julia Bagley.
Oh, hi, Julia.
And the first question that is for the both of you is there anything in your professional lives that you would have done differently? I think we've heard a bit of that already, possibly, but you know.
Sarah, do you want to take that one first?
Oh, so many. Well, I think, yeah, so the question about managing up, that's a really key lesson. I think also, but what it taught me, I think, you know, was always sort of try and understand the first principles and the culture of the place that you're going to. And I think the point actually, which I'm learning a bit now through this new role of corporate strategy, is, you know, be careful that you can define that you're able to define yourself rather than let others. You know, I found actually when I started at the Today programme, within about the first month, there was a piece written by an ex-editor saying I basically sort of ruined it. And it took quite a long time. So he had kind of pretty much defined what I'd done. And for about a year, that was always sort of written about. You know, it was the programme that had been ruined. And I think that it was that I was doing fashion all the time, which was one programme, you know, out of, you know, 1,000 or something. And but so it takes you a long time to get back from that. So I think the thing about just being you know, you don't have to hurry everything. You know, you can wait. You can just, you know, see the lay of the land. You can, and I think the other thing probably is to. It depends how you want to do the job. You know, in my case, I only wanted to do the Today programme really. So I didn't. The things I should have done is being a bit more sort of corporately friendly about, you know, general, you know, meetings. But I think that was a choice. So I limited myself to the Today programme, but that was my choice. So I think some things I, you know, would regret because I could see a way of not being fired from the Sunday Telegraph. On the other hand, you know, sometimes just be true to yourself as well, and, you know, take the consequences, I think. What do you think, Jackie?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think what I might have done differently. I think, you know, I would have been tougher. So I look back and I was one of the first women in the Westminster lobby, and we had some terrible experiences. When I was pregnant, someone came to my political editor and said, would I mind not going down into the lobby because my pregnant stomach, and I you know, it wasn't that large, was offending some of the men there, you know, and things like this. And I just sort of took it and said, oh, okay. And again, when they said, you know, you've got to work all the time, I said, oh, okay. Whereas the women now, I mean, in my day, the idea that you'd have sort of, you know, Emily Maitlis as the lead presenter on Newsnight and Laura Kuenssberg as the political editor, it was sort of unheard of that someone, and they both got children, unheard of that someone with children could do that. And they do it by just saying, no, I'm not going to come in every Sunday, and I'm not going to come. There was one particular program editor when I was on ITN that used to delight in sort of letting me go home at 6 because my shift had finished. And in those days we had these ghastly things called bleeps. So you didn't have a mobile phone, it was a bleep. So your bleep would go off. And I just got home about sort of 7 o'clock after a long drive through the rush hour traffic, absolutely knackered because none of my children slept. And the bleep would go, so, oh, we need you to come back in for news at 10. We think we want this piece for news at 10. So I drive all the way back in, cut a piece for news at 10. And as often as not, he'd then drop it and say, oh, sorry. And looking back, I should have just said, no, I'm not going to do that. You know, but because there weren't many women there saying, this isn't right, this is, you know, unfair. I just said, oh, okay, and went along with it. And with hindsight, I could have been a lot tougher, and maybe I could have gone a lot further then. I don't know.
Yes, saying no, absolutely key, I think. A final way of saying no.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great advice. There's another question that Anita Hoffman's bringing to you about networks. And she says, yes, she agrees. If you want to get into a slightly different field, to have been away from the job market, it's key to get introduced to potential employers. But how do you set that up for younger and older women to understand how to build contacts and networks? Any advice?
I think I've always just sort of phoned people up and said, you know, can you meet for a coffee? And I think most people are very, you know, free with their time and very much wanting to help, particularly younger people. And I don't think, I mean, I noticed Anita said, oh, it's not sleazy. I don't think it is sleazy at all. It's not trying to sort of score one over someone else by phoning someone saying, let's meet for a coffee, or can I have a chat, or could you give me some advice? I think it's what you have to do. And I think you do have to sort of push yourself a bit. And that does mean going and saying to someone, can you give me some advice? Can you give me some information? I think that's the way to do it. I don't know what you think, Sarah. Maybe your business experience is different. I don't know.
I think that's right. I think that the asking for coffee is a good thing. You know, I remember when I was first setting out, and I knew I had to try and find stories. This was way back. So I'd sort of taken someone out I remember taking them out to lunch, being terrified about what they would order, because I couldn't charge expenses at that point. Thinking, oh no, they've gone for the steak. And also, knowing that I didn't quite have stable childcare too. So sitting there absolutely, close to tears, looking at this person eating, and anyway, and thinking, but now actually the coffee always, is really good. And the other thing I do think is back to making your own scene, that that find common interests, and most people are very accessible now, thanks to the internet. You know how to get hold of people.
Yeah.
And so I think just a sort of direct message of could you help, make it, keep the message short, keep it sort of not too complicated, but just could you just give me some advice for 5 minutes, or coffee. I think I'd certainly do that. And actually some of those networks like LinkedIn are really good, that you can just get hold of people. So I think people are pretty accessible now.
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is actually a great way to find jobs these days, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of rubbish on it as well, and you get all sorts of sort of spam links. But I think it's a great way just to kind of, to ask someone a question. And I think most people respond pretty well on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Okay, Sarah, I've got a last question for you here from Julia again. Did you ever solve a puzzle for today without assistance? And Julia's being very honest and says she's never done it herself.
I could never do it.
It's extremely good. There was one, I certainly couldn't do the one. There were some 13-year-old girls, I think, that had set one, who were such a junior recruits for GCHQ. Couldn't do that one. I did do one because I knew what I wanted the answer to be. It was John Humphreys, who was even worse at the puzzles than I was, and just would say blind even time. I think the answer is 11. So just before he left, I said, could we have a puzzle that the answer is 11? And we kind of worked it out that it was. So I knew the answer to that one. But what I liked about that was the puzzle was two things. One was that it introduced a bit of humility amongst the producers and team. So that you're at a slightly unfair advantage at the Today programme, because you've been briefed, you can sound tremendously, knowledgeable about everything, but you can't with the puzzle, and you're clearly out of your depth. And what I loved is that the listeners did know, so suddenly all these math teachers who did know. And so I thought that was a nice, I quite like the inequality of that. And also it was just to kind of put the underlying thing, firstly, that maths matters, and we're going to have to get to understand all this, and that there is a unfair arts bias it tends to be in broadcasting. So it was just to say there are some brilliant people out there who can do these puzzles. None of us can. I notice it's been dropped now.
I used to quite enjoy sort of knowing what I didn't know and feeling stupid every morning, but I think it was quite good.
Very good for you to feel stupid every morning, I think.
Okay. I think we're unfortunately already coming to the end of this hour. So I'm sure that everyone in the audience will want to say a big thank you, and maybe I can ask them to unmute and then let you hear their thank you. I can certainly do that.
You can't see everybody, but it's lovely to see so many friendly faces. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Lovely.
Thanks. Bye.
Anytime.
Yes. And so I'm going to wish you all a wonderful weekend, and hope that you will remember that there is another 2 days for the Lucy Gives action. So you can always go and look that up and donate something. Thank you all for being there. Sarah and Jackie, thank you very much.
Thanks so much,
Thank you, Henriette.
Yeah, on that last point about, if anyone did ever want any personal advice, please, I'm sure Jackie will say the same,
Absolutely.
If we can help in any way.
Yeah.
That's
great
fabulous.
Thank you so
That's
much.
fabulous.
Lovely evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.